At this point in time, Sabertrio has two high-end custom install options in addition to other options on their website, and those are CFX and Proffie. Now, from the outside looking in, obviously these two look different. These are two different hilts. This is a Vectra and this is a solo guard. However, what matters in this video is what is inside. So inside of this Vectra is a CFX, Crystal Focus 10 from Plector Labs, and inside of this is a Proffie 2.2 board. Instantly, you're going to think, well, those are two different soundboards. They're going to function totally differently. And while that is true, Sabertrio has created their own button prop for Proffie, which essentially just means how the buttons work and how the buttons on the Saber influence different functions, whether that be blaster blocks, power on, all that stuff. They have created a button prop that sort of mimics what CFX does and makes it a lot simpler. Now, I'll go over that button prop in a different video. By the time you see this video, that video may already be live, so feel free to check that out. I'll leave that in the description below, and you can check that out in the top right corner if you're here on YouTube. But that's beside the point. In this video, we're just going to talk about the similarities and differences between the two, as many of you may have questions about whether you should go for the CFX, their NeoSaber, or you should go for their Proffie Saber. I've said in the past, and a lot of people already know this, that Proffie can be a little daunting. It can be a little intimidating if you are not as tech savvy, if you have a short attention span and can't pay attention to long tutorial videos. I understand Proffie is a little bit more involved than CFX is when it comes to adding sound fonts, changing your config file, adding blade styles, all that kind of stuff. Proffie has a little bit more involved in it as compared to CFX. CFX, it's almost drag and drop. It's fairly simple. So we'll go over that. I'll talk a little bit about how to add sound fonts and blade styles and stuff between these two. In this video, I've already done Proffie tutorials and CFX tutorials, which are also linked in the description of this video if you're here on YouTube. So feel free to check those out as well. But let's dive right into it. So the differences between the two, obviously there is a difference in the boards. The chassis themselves are almost identical, except for one thing in the Proffie. So if you're unaware, Proffie does not have what we call deep sleep mode. CFX has that. It's essentially after a set amount of time, the Saber will not have power going to it anymore. The battery will not be able to supply power to the board and the Saber won't light up or anything like that. With Proffie, it's essentially, as of right now, it kind of always flows to the board unless you take the battery out, unless you put a kill key in or something like that. And Sabertrio has thought of that with their Proffie Saber, and I'll show that to you right now. Unscrew the pommel real quick, and I'll slide this chassis down so you can see what I'm talking about. So here is the chassis. It looks a little bit different, and I'll talk about the chassis for CFX and Proffie here in a second. It looks a little bit different, but there is the board. That is an orange Proffie board. The color board that you get from Sabertrio will differ because they make all different kinds of Proffie board colors. This one is just orange, which is fine. So that is the board right there. That is the USB port. And I'll take pictures. You will not be able to see it as clearly on camera, on this video camera, but there is a difference between the way that the SD card in Proffie and the SD card in CFX is taken out and put back in. And I'll talk about that again in just a second. But flip it over. There is the battery, removable battery. There's a recharge port, and right there, like I was just talking about, you have to kill power to the board, otherwise your battery is just going to drain with Proffie since there's no deep sleep mode, and that is a kill switch. The kill switch, if it is facing up or if it's on the upside of this kill switch section here, that means the Saber is off. If you flip it on, I don't know if you can hear that because my mic may have cut that out, but now you can see the Saber's on. So I'm going to turn it back off, and as you can see, the thing went off. And that is to sort of mimic what CFX does already, since Proffie does not have the deep sleep function built into their OS yet. That may change in OS 6, that may change when a new Proffie board like the 3.0 comes out. That may change in the future, but as of right now, that's not something that's in there. So Sabertrio has put in a physical way to kill the power to the board other than taking the battery out or something like that. They just flip a switch. It's very easy. And another thing, like I said, I'm going to put pictures in this video, close-up photos, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to this chassis and the way that it's designed between Proffie and CFX. But for Proffie, it's very hard to see but you can kind of see that's the micro SD card there right below the USB port. So that's essentially the exact same thing as how CFX is done. But the way that the micro SD card is held in a Proffie is not the same way that it's held in a CFX. CFX, most of you already know this, it's a little bit more under the board. This has it sticking out a little bit more with Proffie. It's a little bit more under the board in CFX. And to pop the micro SD card out of CFX, you push the SD card in and it comes out. And the same thing is true for when you put it back in. You push it all the way in and then you let go and then it clicks into place. Proffie does not have that function on the micro SD card carriage of the board. You have to pull it out. You just pull it out. There's nothing locking it in, so you don't have to push it in and then pull it out. You just pull it straight out, and then when you're done and you're putting it back into the Saber, you just put it straight in and it'll stop. You don't have to push too hard. Don't push it all the way through because you do not want to break anything on the board, and you especially don't want to break the micro SD card. So that's just something. I'll show some photos here in a second so you can see the difference in the chassis and all that kind of stuff with Proffie and CFX. You have to take note of that because they are two different boards. And if you've never experienced Proffie before and you're used to CFX or vice versa, that's something you'll have to get used to. Other than that, in terms of the chassis, there's not much different here between the Proffie Saber and the CFX Saber. There are other things which I'll talk about in my own personal review of this hilt that I'm not going to talk about in this video because it's not relevant, but the chassis is essentially the same thing, same style chassis as what you're used to with the CFX version of their Saber. So not a whole lot more I'm going to go into on the chassis. Actually, that's pretty much all I'm going to say on the chassis. The important parts are the board. That's what you came to this video for. So let's talk about these boards real quick. Right here, I have Sabertrio's CFX pre-configuration 5.1, which at the time of filming this video is the most current. They're going to update that in the future. If you know anything about Sabertrio, they do a lot of thorough testing so that when a new Crystal Focus 10 firmware comes out, such as the one with the pixel sequencer, if you've been keeping up with CFX updates, that sort of stuff will come in the future and things will be added to that. However, the most current one right now at the time of filming is 5.1. This is what it looks like, has 20 fonts. Most of you have seen this before. The fonts are pretty much the same thing going back to pre-configuration 4.1, 4.2 last year. Pretty much the same thing. The difference in the fonts now is that everything from Gray Meat to Youngling, these fonts have been updated to Smooth Swing. They were not previously Smooth Swing before. They were just normal classic legacy style fonts. So those have been updated to Smooth Swing. Sabertrio's added different things. So that is the CFX pre-configuration 5.1. I just re-updated my Saber to that because it was not that way. I had it on 4.2 from when I originally made my own video tutorial on how to update your Saber. So I just updated that and everything is working perfectly fine. And this is the Proffie pre-configuration 1.0. So let me kind of show you a comparison here between the two. Now, instantly, you look at the first thing. The first one on CFX says Sabertrio. The first one on Proffie says no blade. What this is, it's its own font according to Proffie, but what it is UI sounds created by Caseth Saber fonts. So things like a battery sound, when the blade is put in the Saber, there is a sound that denotes when the blade is actually on the pins and working correctly. These different UI sounds that are made its own font. And when you press the auxiliary switch, when the Saber is off, like the Saber is on, the power is on, but you're not currently using a font. If you just press the auxiliary switch, you'll have a battery meter come up. That is what this is for. So when you get this Saber, do not delete this. Otherwise, you'll lose those functions. You'll lose those UI sorts of things. So don't worry about it too much. It doesn't take up a lot of space, anything like that. Just leave that on there. That's essentially what that is some UI sounds. So you'll go in. The fonts that are on here, the CFX and Proffie, are different as of right now. They are going to update these in the future, I'm sure. I know they're updating the CFX fonts in the future when it comes to pre-configuration 6.0 or whatever they're going to call it, and I'll go into that later in the video. But for Proffie, so the fonts, Sabertrio down to Crossguard, these fonts here, these are all from Caseth Saber fonts. Same thing here, down to Vengeance and Crossguard, those are all from Caseth. And now these fonts here from Snippets, Menace, Temple Guardian, Shock Baton, and the Tragedy, these are all from Kyberphonic fonts. These are not on the CFX yet because they're still doing testing on their pre-configuration and they'll release that in the future. However, you will have those same fonts if you have a CFX Saber. So don't freak out if you buy a CFX Saber in the next reopening and they don't have these specific fonts on there. If you reach out to Sabertrio, and they will make an announcement, I'm sure, when the new pre-configuration comes out, and you will get those fonts as well. So just keep an eye out for that. Those will be coming if you are interested in CFX. So don't freak out and think that you're not going to be included, because you definitely will. And then the rest of the fonts on here, from Teensy all the way down to Tithonian Crystal, these are the default Proffie sound fonts that come from Frederick Hubernet, creator of Proffie, comes from the website. Those were made by Thexter and some other font makers. So I'll go into font makers real quick. Try to keep this as short as I can, but as informative as I can. If you go into the README file, and I'll do the same thing here for Proffie, README file, they look almost identical. This is the Proffie version, and this is the Crystal Focus 10, Sabertrio NeoSaber V2, powered by Crystal Focus X. Firmware version 10.006E, which is what they're using in their pre-configuration 5.1. There will probably be a different firmware version when they go to their pre-configuration 6.0, or whatever they will call it, when they add the new Kyberphonic fonts in there. So just keep an eye out on that. And then Proffie Saber, powered by Proffie 2.2, OS 5.9. Proffie OS 6.0 is right around the horizon. It is coming up quick, and there will be differences, things like edit mode. So those will change, and Sabertrio will make their own pre-configuration update in the future, incorporating some of those functions. So keep an eye out for that as well. These sections here are pretty much the same thing. It's Sabertrio pre-configuration 5.1, Proffie pre-configuration 1.0, and then it has some links to stuff. Kasith, Kyberphonic Fonts, who provided the fonts for them, Sabertrio's site, and then Plector Labs and Proffie 2.2, the Proffie OS sites. So if you need some support or manuals or anything like that, those are there. So those are the readme.txt files for the CFX and the Proffie. If you go into the config file for CFX, that's where you go and you make your changes for blade styles and all that other stuff, all that good stuff. It's very easy to do. Like I said, there are tutorials in the description below. If you go into the Proffie folder, you won't see a config file or anything like that, because all of that is included in this extra folder. Click extra and you'll see a few different things. Contributors here, that will show all the sound fonts that are listed. So all of these sound fonts, and then it shows who made them and a little bit of background on that. So feel free to check that out. And then you see Proffie OS. Now, Proffie OS, this is the most important part here. Proffie OS will have this. So I already have a Proffie OS folder on my desktop. This is not from Sabertrio. This is from the Proffie website. Now, this is what you download. This has your config files, all that stuff. This is how you flash your board through Arduino. That's how you add blade styles, all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do here is show you how to use this from Sabertrio. So like I said, this is their pre-configuration. Everything you see right here will be on the SD card of the Proffie Saber from Sabertrio when you buy it. You're going to go to Extra, you're going to go to Proffie OS. And what I'm going to do is rename the folder that's already on my desktop. I'll just add a 1 to it. It's not OS 1, it's actually OS 5.9. But what I'm going to do is copy this Proffie OS folder from the Sabertrio SD card from their pre-configuration, and I'm going to paste that on my desktop. Now, what this is going to do is going to allow Arduino to find it. So I'm going to go to Proffie OS, and I'm going to go to config. There are 2 folders in here that you need to pay attention to when it comes to Sabertrio. There's config, and there's S3 config. This is the Sabertrio config file for Proffie. And I actually pulled that up in an app called Sublime Text 3 because it's easier to read. This is the config file from Sabertrio. So they've already pre-configured all the settings, all the blade styles, all the sound fonts, all of that stuff. So this works right out of the box. You don't have to make any adjustments if you don't want to. Sabertrio has configured both their CFX and their Proffie exactly how they want to do it, as close to, Canon style sound fonts and Canon style blade styles. They've already done all that for you. So you don't need to change anything if you don't want to. Everything works right out of the box. All you got to do is have fun with it. But if you choose to change anything, you have that option. It is not that difficult. You just have to pay attention to what you're doing. And like I've already said a couple times, there are tutorials in the description of this video. So feel free to check that out if you need help. However, this is the config file if you do decide to make changes. Do not change anything you see up here. These are called optional defines. Define these little lines here that said define in front of them. These will change in the future when Sabertrio makes updates, when OS 6 comes and they do their second pre-configuration. They'll make changes to that. And also if you've already, messed with Proffie before, then you can add and do all that stuff. However, leave this as is for now when it comes to Sabertrio's config file for the Proffie. So include props s3 button config.h. This is the S3 config, and then inside the Proffie OS folder, there is props, S3 button config, which I'll go over very briefly. This essentially just tells the Saber what to do. I've already done a video, which I'll link in the description as well, that show exactly how to trigger all of these different effects, battery level, how to turn the blade on, blade off, next sound font, all that stuff. I've already done a video on that, so I'll leave that in the description below. But essentially what it does is how it tells the Saber how to do different things. So include props S3 button config. That's the file I just showed you. So this, once, like I said when I was showing you the font folders, leave this in there. This is the no blade thing. Those are the UI files, the menu sounds, all that kind of stuff. Proffie doesn't have a menu per se, a font menu like CFX does. It just has, it just goes to the next sound font, but there are different sounds and stuff that were created by cases. So do not touch this here. It doesn't take up a whole lot of room on the config file. Just don't touch it. That is the UI sounds. Then you have one Sabertrio. These all match up with the sound fonts that are on the Sabertrio pre-configuration. These are all the blade styles. So as you can see here, it has to perfectly match on the config file what it says in the font folders. So 0-no_blade, 0-no_blade, 1-Sabertrio, and so on and so forth. And what Sabertrio has done in their config file is they've kind of explained what the blade styles are, which is helpful. It's fully responsive, random flicker blade style, and it's blue. So Sabertrio font is blue. The dark edition font is red. The light is deep sky blue, which is kind of like a cyan. The balance is green, and so on and so forth. And there are, it kind of just goes on and on and on. And you can check those out. So you don't have to mess with this unless you feel like adding a new sound font, which I'll get into in just a second. I'll show you real quick how to add a different sound font. So these two folders right here are not the SD cards per se, because I don't have the SD cards from the Sabers actually plugged into the computer right now. These are just the folders that you get on the SD card. So I'll show you that way. Essentially what you're going to do here is you're going to take, for example, the Tragedy, which is a font that is not currently on the CFX pre-configuration, but it's on the Proffie pre-configuration. I'm going to take the Tragedy and put it on the CFX. So the Tragedy, you have all this stuff in there. I'm going to copy the Tragedy. I'm going to paste it into the SD card for CFX, which is just a folder on my computer right now, but you'd be putting this on the SD card of the CFX. So I'm going to add that in there, and I'm going to just put it at the end. So 21 dash, and then that's all good to go. So that's how you add it for CFX. It's not that hard. You can go in to the font_config, and then you can, mess with different stuff. Like I said, there are tutorials on how to do that in the description below if you want to change that stuff. But that's how you're going to add it for CFX. Now for Proffie, we'll add another sound font. We'll just do the dual, Ronin, because that's one of my favorite fonts now by Kyberphonic. Going to go to Ronin Proffie, and you'll notice that there are different file folders, all that stuff. You're going to go to Ronin Proffie, copy, and this is the Proffie SD card, which again is just a folder on my computer right now. I'm going to paste that in, and then just like how we do with CFX, I'm going to follow the same pattern. You don't have to name it this way for Proffie. This is just how Sabertrio did it, and it kind of cleans it up. So I'm going to do the same exact thing, essentially, and I'm going to do that. Ronin Proffie. So you have the folder, the font folder on the SD card, but you also have to add it to the config file. So we're going to go back to the config file, and at the very end, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste a pre-existing blade profile from here, because I'm not going to, make this a super long video if I don't have to, and I'm going to just kind of go with the flow here. So what I'll do is I'll copy Dark Editions, and I'll kind of just copy this entire thing, and I'm going to paste it at the end of this, and then I'm going to change it to match Ronin Proffie. So this was sound font 19, and it is called Ronin_Proffie. You have to spell it exactly the same as it is on the SD card. So Ronin_Proffie, and then you can change it right here if you want. This doesn't actually make a difference here, but you can name that right there. So that would be how you do it. You'd save that, you'd put it into the config folder, or it should already be in the config folder for the Proffie OS folder. So that sounds like a whole bunch of nonsense what I just said, but Proffie OS, this file that I'm editing right here, this is in the Proffie OS folder, config, S3 config. That's what I'm currently messing with here. So I would save it, do that. Then I'd go to Proffie OS, open with Arduino IDE, and then I would test, go through there, I'd verify it, and then I'd upload it. Like I said, there are tutorials below where you can go figure out how to do that. And I want to keep this video as short as possible, so I won't be going through all of that in this video. So essentially, that's the difference between adding the sound fonts. You can go in and mess with the blade styles for CFX and Proffie and all that kind of stuff on your own time, but that's not what I'm going to do in this video. So essentially, when it comes to things like the button props, how CFX works versus Proffie, I already have videos in the past. I have the one that I did last November that show exactly what you get from Sabertrio when you buy a CFX version, the NeoSaber, and very, very simple, power on, press the button, blah, blah, blah. All of that is in that video, and the Proffie version in comparison is in another video which I just recorded, which is also in the description below. So feel free to check those out if you're wondering how it works as compared to Proffie and CFX when it comes to Sabertrio Sabers. There's not a huge amount of difference. It's essentially 80% the same. Now, when it comes to editing things, that's where it is quite a bit different. So when it comes to actual usability and functionality, there isn't a huge amount of difference, but you can, play with that kind of stuff on your own, and Sabertrio will make updates to those as they see fit. When different OS updates come out for CFX or Proffie or what have you, those things will change. So when it comes to CFX versus Proffie, you're not missing out on anything if you get one over the other. It kind of comes down to preference. Don't be scared of the Proffie if you've never done it before. If you've never owned a Proffie saber, if you've never messed around with it, it is not scary. It shouldn't be scary to you. It may be a little intimidating if you've never messed with it before, because people tell you need to know a whole lot about coding. You don't really need to know how to do a whole lot of anything, really. You just have to be able to follow directions and do things the right way. Otherwise, you may start to run into issues, but that's not a concern here. It is very simple. Sabertrio has really simplified it. And like I said, if you don't want to change anything, you don't have to, because Sabertrio has done their CFX and their Proffie versions excellently, and you don't need to change anything if you don't want to. They've already pre-configured it really well. So you can play with it all you want, and you'll really never get bored because they have great sound fonts on there, really good blade styles for some of the new fonts such as Shock Baton and the Tragedy by Kyberphonic, showing a lot of functionality there. And I really, really enjoy the way that they did their Proffie. And I really think that it is a great option if you're interested in that. You shouldn't be scared of the Proffie versus CFX. Both of them are great, and Sabertrio did both of them really well. And they edited the Proffie to sort of mimic the CFX in case you missed that CFX functionality and the way things work. So like I said, a CFX versus Proffie, if you're interested in either, there is not a ton of difference between the functionality, the raw functionality of the two sabers when you have it in your hand. Not a huge amount of difference, but when it comes to editing things, that's where it comes into play, where the difference is. But like I said, you don't have to change anything if you don't want to. So as I said, feel free to check out the videos in the description below. I have a few tutorials and I have a few videos that cover things like the Proffie sound fonts that Sabertrio has pre-configured on their saber, as well as the functionality, what the buttons do, how to trigger certain things. Those videos are in the description below, as well as tutorials on how to add sound fonts, blade styles, all of that stuff for CFX and Proffie. So feel free to check those out as well. Thank you all so much for watching, and may the force be with you.